this session is about this very curious character called John Lang, who was an Australian lawyer, writer, journalist who lived in India between 1846 and 1864 when he died here. 1842 to 1864. It's 22 years of his adult life he spent mostly in India, a few years in England, and he was also the lawyer for Ranee of Jhansi, amongst other things. Now that's one of the least important things that he did, but that is sort of the key word for the book to sell in India, the lawyer of Ranee of Jhansi. And I also think that as a lawyer his contribution is not so much as a journalist and as a writer. But what is interesting about this book is, apart from John Lang, it's about the writing itself. It was part of my PhD from JNU, and I also spent a year in Australia researching about him. And here in Australia I did not intend to, but it was highly frustrating to find that we recycled all our paper. So there was nothing to be found, not much to be found here. I roamed around Calcutta, Bombay, Pune, Meerut, Agra, and found this much. I found that much. So it also tells about how much importance we attach to history. But and also I want to comment upon the processes of writing and the processes of history writing, which often goes ignored, unacknowledged when it's written, because then it's written in a certain format, and all the journey that is involved is never detailed in it. The interesting thing about this book is that it details the entire journey of how I went where and what happened, and how I lost certain things, how I found certain things, all of that. Apart from that, I also wanted to write it very differently, because the subject matter is so rich that if it is confined to the discipline of history or even literary analysis, it would seem dry. So I had come back from Australia, and I had a very pretty backpack which I went to watch a play. It was stolen. I found the thief also a few months later, but pen drive, and it had all the newspapers of John Lang scanned on it. So I lost a lot of material, and I was in shock. It was time for me to write. And a couple of months I just kept investigating how I could find the bag back. And then there were only 4 months left to write. And so with my supervisor, I sat down one night over something from Malibu, and we tried to talk all night, but talked about other things, everything apart from John Lang. And at 4 a.m. I said, okay, now let's talk about John Lang. And now that it has to be written, what do you think? And he told me that, look, and all night, like John Lang, we had been drinking certain things. So finally he said that, look, Pablo Picasso knew how to draw portraits very well. Also, if you don't know about that, he's a very good realist artist. And he gave that up to do what he did, Cubism. And so my supervisor said that Pablo Picasso knew how to draw portraits very well, but he did what he did, and so you should do what you should do. And in the state that I was, I said, all right, then let's do something else. Instead of 5 chapters of a PhD, let's do 50 chapters, 10 pages each. And he is a professor of theory, and I also used to teach theory. I had just started teaching then. And I said, and zero theory. We'll strip it off completely. Let the narrative itself be theory. And so that's how it began. Next day, of course, he said, no, this is not happening. This will be too much. We have to reduce it to 17, 18 something. This is what I did, reduced it to 18 chapters, but hid 3 inside each of them. So 18 into 3 became 54. That's how it stands right now. And there's my publisher, Trisha, who gave me a very hard time, because in those 4 months I went crazy and wrote 1,70,000 words, 15 hours a day. mostly thumbs up. It's not an advertisement. But when it came to Trisha, she said, yes, absolutely, let's do this. And after a couple of months after I was drawn in, she said, this is too fat. We had to reduce it by half. So, so 2 lakh had to become 1 lakh. And the rewriting, the editing took much more time because the style had to be kept consistent with the original. And of course, one changes as a writer over a period of time, the way you write, the way you think. And also, at that point of time, I used to think like a 19th century man. I was so deeply into it that my language was 19th century, the way I spoke. So a few years down the line, it was difficult to retain that flavor. So the editing was more difficult than writing. But I'm glad. Probably she was right. Probably people wouldn't read a 1,000-page book. 500 as it stands now itself is a little daunting, but I'm told that people have read it cover to cover, and I'm glad it's turned out that way. But I also want to talk about how these things happen, how it is in life that lead you to these things rather than as a decided subject or something. So I was looking for something else entirely. I was in Pune University at one point of time, hanging out with a friend, and I was shown Alice Richmond's grave. There's Alice Pune University, and Alice Richmond's grave is over there. So it's another grave in some university, but it caught my eye because there were urban legends around it. Of course, it's inside a university, so there'll be stories, and a white girl's grave from 1882. So that her ghost haunts the campus. She roams around in white robes at night with a candle and all of that. That she was in love with an Indian boy and committed suicide over unrequited love. These kind of things. Which was cool, but still hadn't caught my eye until I saw the grave, and what was written on it. It was died at this spot and is buried at this spot. That is what caught my eye. Too romantic a line to be ignored. And so then I set, sort of got determined to find out more about her. And there was nothing about her. Because she was not a military general, she was not a civil servant, she was none of those things. So it was very difficult to find any archival material about her. But one day, looking up an encyclopedia, actually a cyclopedia, earlier encyclopedias were called cyclopedias, Cyclopedia of Australian Poetry 1788 to 1888, I found a poem called On the Death of Alice Richmond, died 14 January 1882. Very specific, so there's no ambiguity about that. This is the very Alice Richmond upon whose death the poem is written. And it was by Margaret Thomas, an Australian-born sculptor, arguably the first Australian-born sculptor. And that piqued my interest that something can be really found out about her. And then I did. So that's another story. I did find out lots of stuff about her. She was the niece of Sir James Ferguson, who was married into a South Australian, let's say, wealthy family. And Walter Watson Hughes was associated with that family. He had fought a duel over in India, ran away from India, made money off opium, established the Adelaide University, all kinds of crazy stories. um, so I'll tell you one and couple of more interesting Alice stories and how John Lang happened with all that. So when I was in Australia researching about John Lang, which is later, there was a professor who was from South Australia and very interested in this Alice story, and he said, let's go to her village. And even he didn't know where the village was, having lived all his life over there. So we looked up the map. It's not yet the Google Maps era, so we were carrying maps and went to this place called Melrose. And indeed, it was Alice's village because her name was all over, her surname, Richmond Valley, Richmond Park, this and that. We went to the library of Adelaide University, couldn't find anything. And the professor said this family must have gone back to England. That is why there are no records, otherwise they are arguably the wealthiest family of that time, which was conflicting. She came from Australia, they went back to England, what is happening? Couldn't figure out. So we roamed around all day, did all kinds of things, could find nothing. In the end, in the evening, I said, let us let us go to the local historical society. So in Australia, every small community has their historical society because the white history is only 200 years old. And the Aboriginal history is the longest in the world. It's unbroken for 50,000 words, so 50,000 years. So one can imagine the amount of decimation that happened there. But anyway, so the white people keep their records very assiduously because it's only 200 years old to have a sense of history. So I said, let's go check out this local history society. We went there was an old lady knitting sweater, the sky was overcast, it was about to rain. And she said, oh, yeah, I have a visitor after months. I would love to entertain you, serve you tea, but the sky is overcast and I have to get home. It will rain very heavily in a minute. Can you come back tomorrow? I said, no, we're just on a day trip. We've come from 100 kilometers away. And we know we're not going to find much, but we were giving it a shot. She said, what is it? I said, there's this family called Richmond family who used to live here in the 1880s. And in particular, this girl called Alice of that family. And suddenly she froze. And she said, wait. Went, opened her cupboard, brought out a file, opened it, looked through it and said, is your name Amit? And my hair stood at its ends. I was like, what? This person called Dr. John McCarthy had been researching on Margaret Thomas, the lady who wrote that poem about Alice. So he also read that poem and said, like me, very much like me, he also wondered who the F is Alice, wrote a letter to them. So he could have, and so he read my blog on which I had written some things about very preliminary stuff, 3 lines that I had written, and said that if this gentleman ever comes by, please give him this file. So he could have written, emailed me, commented on my blog. He didn't do any of that. He just printed it out and left that message for me. So I went on a hunt for him in Melbourne, but couldn't find him. Probably he was dead. And other things happened. So these kind of things happen. And also what I read on the grave, died at this spot and is buried at this spot, was not on the grave. I found a year later that I had completely imagined it, but not imagined it. It was a premonition. 3 years later, I was in Meerut in this very beautiful church built by Begum Samrood, which is the first Catholic church in North India, in the Italian style, not in the Georgian style that we find all over India. And there's a grave of Father Adiotus Nastagi, which says, died at this spot and is buried at this spot. So I had a premonition of what is coming in a couple of years, but that egged me on to find out. So initially when I was trying to find out about Alice, I didn't know what to do, so I used the Hanuman methodology, which is to pick up the entire mountain if you don't know where the Sanjeevani Bhutte is, and whatever Australians were doing in India, I started reading about it, and it's a gold mine still. For example, South Australian girls, they were very wild. They were girls like cowboys, and the standard of womanhood in England was, of course, socio-somatic snobbery, where girls had to faint on listening to bad news, and they were groomed for marriage, and which is why the discipline of home science, etc., etc. And home was England for all Australians, so they were very perturbed by these girls going rogue, and so they were sent to England for finishing school. But unfortunately, there were no flights at that point in time, so you had to go through Colombo or through Bombay, and many of these girls would run away with Indian boys. This is what would happen. And there are many interesting stories of let's say gold digging Melbourne girls. 4 or 5 who married princes in the first half of 20th century. I'm not going to that. So what they did was, then they said the best way is to make these girls nuns. So South Australian Baptist mission started sending them out as nuns to India. And mostly in Pune and in Bengal, which were the strongholds of this mission. So there's one meeting of this mission where in a meeting of, at a conference of 150 people, 145 are women and 5 are men. But what happened as a result of this was that, of course, these were wild girls. So, and they did not have access to the men folk very carefully, so they would be allowed to interact only with women. So the women in the zananas of Bengal suddenly learned English and learned all these new feminist ideas and everything. And so you see Muslim women of around Dhaka learning English, suddenly unlettered women starting to speak English and having these ideas. So there's this very interesting novel by Rokia Khatun, Sultana's Dream, which is now prescribed in some universities, a female utopia. And it's written in English in 1905. She acknowledges the presence of an Australian sister who inspired her to write this, and all this is happening in a dream, where men have locked themselves up because they were not able to handle the affairs of the world, fight battles. So they have given up power to women. And women do not fight battles with guns and swords. They merely use concave lenses to deflect sunlight onto the enemy, and the enemy runs away. They cook with solar energy. They fly with solar energy. There's no road traffic. It's all garden. And women work only 2 hours in a day as opposed to 8 hours for men, because men used to gossip and smoke for the rest of the 6. So it's 2 is good enough to, and the rest of the day is to dream and to do creative things. So it's very so all these things I kept discovering, and then in between came John Lang somewhere, um, a drunk lawyer who fights cases only of Indians against the British, and who writes against the British every single day in his newspaper. I said, wow, this is something in the middle of all this that can be looked at. And then there was no looking back once I started, and I'm still at it. That lost pen drive, I'm still subsequently my 3 trips to America. So I went on Fulbright thrice to America. There also I've been scanning John Lang newspapers for something else in the future. The next book probably will be about his newspaper itself, which does not go missing in the book, but in the current book, but which needs a special attention because of the kind of contents it has. The newspapers then were very different from today's newspaper. The first page would be literature, would be a serialized novel or a poem by a leading author, or by John Lang himself if he felt the poem was good enough on the first page. There would be discussions about various pseudoscience matters like spiritualism, what is called Planchet now, um, or discussion over cholera, mesmerism, all kinds of things, very all the 19th century stuff. But literature is a huge part of it, which also tells you how important writers still were in 19th century. So there's definitely a book over just the newspaper. Anyway, coming to John Lang himself now, there's no real connection between John Lang and Alice Richmond except that he was part of the legal fraternity. So were some people in her family part of the legal fraternity roughly at the same time. But he had left Australia, even though he was very well known in Australia. He had left Australia, so it's unlikely that there was much between them. So John Lang was born in 1816 and died in 1864 in Mussoorie, like I said. He's buried in Camel's Back Cemetery over there. I've never been able to find his grave, and I hope not to find his grave. And he came to India at the age of 26 after, so his schooling was in Sydney and in a grammar school where he learned Latin very well, so he also wrote poems in Latin, which is very curious that they were still doing that in 19th century. While here we were also trying to, there was a Sanskrit revivalist movement also going on, so the global trends are always similar. So then he went to study law at Middle Temple in England, came back, and in Australia at that point of time there was a huge caste gap, and I'm using the word caste, between the free people and those of the convict origin. So between free people and convict would be a clear gap of legality, but the descendants have a gap, is a caste gap, that your grandfather was a thief, therefore you are a second-grade citizen. And there were no thieves. Basically, if you stole a spoon, you were sentenced to death. and then it was commuted to labor for life in Australia. That is how they built the colony, because they had run out of labor in India and other colonies in Fiji, in the Caribbean, and so nothing was left. And so the so-called dregs of the Society of England was used to build Australia, and which is why Australia today is a very fascinating society. Is much very classless, much more class-free than England or America, largely because everybody's father is a thief. It's called the Commonwealth of Thieves also. But at that point in time, there was a clear caste distinction between free people and convict people, and John Lang was of the convict origin. And so he had a difficult time as a young lawyer, and he started fighting for it. And overshot his brief. He even went on to say that Australia should be an independent country. It became independent, like he had said, 40 years later, but then it was too early for all the outrageous things that he was saying, for that the emancipists, which is people of the convict origin, should have equal rights and so on and so forth. So he did not find much success as a lawyer in Australia, in Sydney. His brother-in-law was judge in Calcutta High Court, so he suggested, why don't you come to India and try your luck? And the moment he landed in India, he knew this was it, because he was looking to fight the establishment. He was looking to fight the British gentry, and this was the perfect ground to do it, with Indians as allies. And so that is the story of the white man fighting the white man, that he did not spare a single day in his career in India launching a new invective against the British government in India. So he started a newspaper in Calcutta called the Mofussilite, and then for some reason he thought he was a small towner, and which is what Mofussilite means. And so he didn't like Calcutta that much and moved to Meerut, from where he operated most of his life, and would move to Mussoorie and Shimla every summer, because all the scandal was in Mussoorie, and so he would go to Mussoorie to gather the scandals and also to enjoy the summer months, so to say. So the three paths to John Lang's career: as a lawyer, as a journalist, and as a writer, and all three are equally fascinating. He did not care about the legal career. He was in it only to make money, but he realized that this could also be a very useful weapon to fight the British, so he did. And he won one of the most famous cases of that time, against in a military court of the British military. He won the case inside it, so which was phenomenal, because it was a staged case and he was able to turn it around and win it. So he became one of the most famous lawyers of the time. So the case was of one Lala Jyoti Prasad, who's also a very interesting character, and which is another trail I'm still following. I got in touch with his descendants, or they got in touch with me somehow, and there's a potential something in it also. And my research methodology was wild. At one point, because the spelling is Persaud, P-E-R-S-A-U-D, which survives in the Caribbean, not here. Here it's reconverted to Prasad. Unlike in Bengal, where Chattopadhyay became Chatterjee, so it remained like that, or Thakur became Tagore, remained like that, but North India converted its surnames back. So Persaud is mostly in the Caribbean, so I found that there's a professor called Moti Persaud in US. I wrote an email to him. Do you know Jyoti Persaud? Are you a descendant? Jyoti and Moti. So the rhyme was my methodology, and he freaked out a little, because he was involved in some court case at that point of time, and he thought I'm a spy and ferreting information out of him. So he sent me a very rude mail saying that these methods of spying won't work on me, etc., etc. Said whatever. Anyway, so Lala Jyoti Prasad was a commissariat contractor giving provisions to the British in Anglo-Sikh wars. He built the British government, not the British government, East India Company at that point in time, this pre-revolution, 30 lakh rupees in 1850, which is, you can imagine what it is now. So instead of paying him that money, they put a case of forgery on him. And John Lang was the guarantor in the case. Why he was is also very interesting. The meeting between John Lang and Lala Jyoti Prasad earlier, in which Lala Jyoti Prasad used to live in a bungalow in Agra, and they were digging inside his bungalow, and they found a basement in which there were people walled up with jewels, and so probably a couple had been punished for love and walled up. दीवारों में चिनवा दिए गए थे, and these kind of things. And so Lala Jyoti Prasad suddenly became rich with all the jewels that were on the person of that girl, etc. And that's how John Lang had met him and taken a fancy to Lala Jyoti Prasad. And so he was fighting that case, and he was particularly angry because his coat and his umbrella had been taken away. Because he was not there in person as a guarantor, and he was angry at his umbrella having been stolen by the cops. So there are a couple of versions, whether he was in India or whether he was in England. He himself said he had come from England. My calculations suggest that he never went to England at that point of time. So he was just cooking up a good story in retelling about this case. So anyway, he came to fight the case from England, let's assume his own version. And 5 days he didn't say anything in the court. He just listened, cooled his heels, smoked his cigars, also drank by the side, and Lala Jyoti Prasad was very worried that all his money had gone into waste that on this drunk man, and nothing is going to happen. So on the 6th day, John Lang got up and tore the prosecution to shreds. He had been making points of 5 days, and he pointed out each thing meticulously, detailed the war and all the bills and everything, and within 2 days they knew that the case had turned around. And so a night before the judgment was to be pronounced, John Lang's friends asked him what he thought of the jury. And he said, they are a bunch of damned sewers. So this was written by William Forbes Mitchell much later, and he said that John X. Shaw was the leading spirit of the day, and John Lang was no teetotaler. So John Lang over John X. Shaw was asked this question, and he called the jury a bunch of sewers. So his friend said, ये सब बोलना तो बड़ा आसान है, शराब पी के कोर्ट में बोल सकते हो तो बताओ. Of course, what are you talking? So 1,000 rupee bet was laid for him to call them pigs on their face on the next day. And in the court he said this part of the case that he came aboard on the ship called Nile, and which is where he had to make up the story of coming from England, even though he may have been in India. That he came aboard the ship Nile, and they served rotten pork on the ship. And this part of the case where you have accused Lala Jyoti Prasad of forgery on such and such date, which has been accused by that jury member, stinks like the hind leg of the pork. And so on and so forth. He named all parts of the anatomy of the pork and called them pigs on their face. And the judge advocate general in the end said that he was ashamed to even have been associated with the case. If he had known that this was such a rotten case and open and shut, he would not have agreed to be the judge advocate general. So he won the case and the bet. So that was 1,000 rupees in addition of 10% that he got from Lala Jyoti Prasad. So 3 lakhs out of 30. So he was a very rich lawyer for the time. Just courtesy that one case. But the story just begins here. It doesn't end over here. Lala Jyoti Prasad, apart from those 3 lakhs, gave him a gold brocaded portrait of himself. And this became John Lang's lucky charm. He would carry it with him everywhere he went. So he went to England to further his literary career. He was very ambitious as a writer. He wanted to be Charles Dickens. He was a very close friend of Charles Dickens, and actually a lot of Charles Dickens is John Lang for literature students. I'll come back to it in a minute. Now 1857, Nana Sahib killed women and children, or his soldiers did. There's always a bone of contention who did that, but children and women died, British. And so Nana Sahib became a villain overnight. So as much of a hero as he is in Indian imagination, he is that much of a villain in British imagination. And they started hunting for him. He was the most wanted man. And there was no picture of Nana Sahib, even though daguerreotype had come, but there was no picture available to the British. So they thought, the journalists in London thought that this guy John Lang definitely has a picture of Nana Sahib, because he's written about Rani of Jhansi, Nana Sahib, everybody. He hangs out with all the nobility of India. He fights their cases. So he had already fought the case of Rani of Jhansi by then. Um, so this journalist from Illustrated London News went and saw this gold brocaded portrait in his house and said, "Oh, that must be Nana Sahib." And John Lang said, "Well, this, as much as you resemble the Queen, this man resembles Nana Sahib only that much." But the journalist thought, no, he's just trying to protect his friend. And he said, "Anyway, I want the portrait," and said, "Suit yourself." And that portrait became Nana Sahib's portrait in Illustrated London News. And that is what has gone down in history books largely as Nana Sahib's picture, Lala Jyoti Prasad's. So Lala Jyoti Prasad, for a second time, I didn't tell about the first time, became the most wanted man in India. The first time when he had gone missing, and there was money on his head, 1 lakh to be found alive, 2 lakh to be 1 lakh to be found alive, 2 lakh to be found dead. Because if he was found alive, he'd fund his own thing, and if he died, whatever. So, and the second time he had become inadvertently, despite having won the case, the most wanted man. So Jyoti Prasad went into hiding, but his supporters were very distraught, and his supporters were very happy that he looked like a warrior and looked like Nana Sahib, because all the adornments were done to the portrait. And Nana Sahib's supporters were distraught that he doesn't have a pot belly. What is this? What does this mean? Why is he looking like a Lala? And so this is very interesting how history plays out in these forms, and what you think of as primary sources may also be erroneous down the time. So the Rani of Jhansi was very impressed, and she invited him to be his lawyer, which is very bad timing, because John Lang had already been sent to jail because of the Lala Jyoti Prasad case. He had called Colonel MacTeer, one of the jury members, a coward. So he had dug up, a proper researcher, like we are talking about a case in 1850, he had dug up files of 1824 and found out that one of the jury members had run away from a battle and was declared a coward and was reinstated and bribed his way through, rose up in the ranks and so on and so forth. So he had found all of that and called him a coward, and he was very smart. He had sold his newspaper, so nothing is on his name, and Ghost wrote in his own newspaper, and despite that he was jailed in Calcutta for 2 months. So he told the Rani that, that there's not much point, because you lose the case if I am the lawyer. But she anyway wanted to go ahead with it. And she indeed did lose the case within a week, because it was the doctrine of lapse case. So if the rule itself says that if you don't have a biological child, you will forfeit your kingdom, there was not much to be done. If John Lang was the lawyer who the British government wanted to settle scores with, also wasn't going to help the case. So she lost the case within a week. But this is one of the most fascinating documents about the Rani of Jhansi, because no other white writer has written about her or had met her. So there's a whole page of description, and Lang's description are like novels, because he was a writer. So about her beauty, and he says that she's buxom and must have been a real beauty in her youth. She was only 26, so this also tells about what youth was at that point of time. And that she lifted the veil to show her face, which she never lifted for anyone, which may be an exaggeration or whatever. And then as it gets exaggerated in popular media, and on ZTV, when they made a serial on Rani of Jhansi, there's an episode about John Lang in which they're playing cricket and flirting with each other, and all kinds of things are happening. So nothing happened except that she lifted the veil for him, probably, if he's right, which I don't think. He's just bragging. But she did give him lots of gifts, an elephant, jewels, her own portrait. All of that is lost because John Lang's family shifted to Burma, and then there's the Second World War, so where the property went. There's no personal property of John Lang. There are no diaries, nothing. So it's all of the thing I've done is by his own accounts and by what other people have said about him, and his newspaper, etc. So it's been gleaned from what I'm telling you very simply is a lot of hard work to get each part of the episode in order. So that was his role as lawyer largely, and on one occasion, uh, which thankfully this is the only good part of the when I was editing the book, that in the while writing it I did not know this incident which I'm going to narrate very well. While editing it, I re-researched it and found out what it was. So there was a man supplicating to a king, and he was not able to do it properly. So John Lang intervened. He was in the court at that point of time, in Darbhanga Maharaja's court, and he said, "I'll argue on your behalf." And that man was a big man. He picked up John Lang and threw him into the crowd. So, and the newspaper says that Lang wasn't hurt, but his ego definitely was. Um, so, I'd initially thought this was an Indian man and he was arguing the case, trying to argue the case in Urdu. He'd learned Urdu and Farsi very fast. Turns out it was a French circus man who'd been traveling across the world taking his circus, and he'd been swindled of some money, and being a French man, he did not know English. So he was he also knew French, so he was trying to interpret from French to English to Urdu to the king, and and he got angry because he didn't, because he thought that his English was good enough or whatever, something of that sort. He did throw Lang into the crowd. It's a big man. So there are many kinds of these kind of anecdotes, and also that history writing buries these kind of anecdotes, because they are anecdotes and they do not have the authority of a historian writing about it, or a particular kind of archive that you want. And so these are buried, and a lot of flavor of a person's life is also lost like that. So anyway, coming to his newspaper. Newspaper is very interesting. Like I said, it's very literary, and he had also learned Urdu and Farsi very fast. So he was also translating Gulistan of Sadi of Shiraz, which is still a very celebrated text. Um, so, like I said, his two main agendas in his newspaper were to lampoon the judiciary, of which he was a part. He was part of the legal fraternity. So he endlessly tells how boring these court cases are, how there's nothing in them, how the farce is played out in these court martials, in the military courts also, and how all this paperwork which remains as our legacy, and in our language, लिख के दे देंगे, I'll give it to you in writing, as if giving it in writing makes any difference. If it's given in writing, it's even more tedious. You have to go to a court, file an affidavit, fight for 30 years to prove what was written. And what is it about? Why is the spoken word not as important as the written word? And so we still say, I'll give it to you in writing. So he says that the British considered the Indians hostile, that these poor witnesses would come and be bribed with a bottle of liquor, and they would change their statement. And so they started writing everything. And the writing was pointless because these people were illiterate. And so their thumb impression was taken. So it became even more draconian than the spoken word. At least spoken word, there's a bunch of witnesses to corroborate that he's changed his statement. In the written word, it's just the thumb impression. And you can completely transfer the property, change a family's fortune, anything could happen. So he lampoons the judiciary and the legal system on a daily basis in his newspaper, and point by point. It's very sharp, very precise. And then the Indian military. And he also has written very interesting novels about the Indian military at that point of time, and says things like, do not care much about the major general. He's a drunk. He's a major general because he was yesterday a captain. 4 people above him died of cholera. which is why he's the Major General today. Because everybody dies of cholera and plague in India, so nobody's rank tells you anything except that his seniors have died. um, and very interesting things like the women, the wives were not allowed to stay in the barracks if their husbands died. And so they were always on the lookout. Always a backup husband was ready in case the husband died. And so husbands would die and they would immediately remarry to stay in the barracks. And in some funny incidents, the dead husband would come back. So in one of the novels, this happens. There's a whole bunch of people who have died in battle, and 10 women get married, and all the 10 husbands come back, and then there's a duel between the new husbands and the old husbands, and things of that order. So there's routine fun making of the military and judiciary, and which is food for thought. Actually, you could transfer all those documents and print them for today. They could well seem like it's today's world. So what is interesting is that this was allowed in the 1850s. This was a done thing. He did go to prison, but they had to put a lot of effort and the entire might of the military establishment. And he was out in 2 months also as a much bigger hero, and he was smoking cigars inside jail also, and so on. But the power that writers and journalists wielded at that point which is not a democracy, which is an empire where it's a dictatorship, and still the journalist has that kind of free will, that kind of leeway to say whatever he wants to say about the establishment, and also get rich along with it. And so his informers were the military wives. All his friends were women, and which is why his novels are feminist, because which is very odd in Victorian age when all the novels are about the shyness of women and them seeking out husbands. His novels are quite the opposite. The women are the heroes of his novels because they were his audience. That's how his newspaper sold. So he's very smart. He knows his audience and what to write for them. And he gleans information about the military from the wives, and it's all authentic information. So his information is also much better than other newspapers, which would come from official sources, which would be much toned down. There would be no scandal in them. He would have the real scandals from the horse's mouth. So at one point of time, Lord Hardinge summoned him, and he was so disturbed by John Lang's daily invective that he summoned him and said, "What is happening? Why do you write so much against me?" And he said, "My lord, why did you come to India? Did you come to make money?" And Hardinge said, "Well, I'm a poor man." Hardinge is one of the richest people of England. And said, "Well, I'm a poor man, so of course I've come to make money." So he said, "If you are a poor man, what am I? So I also have a right to make money, and I make much more money writing against you than I can ever by praising you." And Lord Hardinge was so pleased with his wit that he made him his state guest in Shimla. And after that did not complain about whatever he wrote. He let him write whatever he wrote. And in fact, in 1857, while he was writing against the British, with the battle raging, his newspaper was being printed from inside the Agra fort under the protection of the British military. So these are the kind of things that did exist at that point of time, which one cannot think that an officially protected press can write against that very office to bring it down. There's one other very interesting incident in which the cops had burnt down a village in pursuit of a thief. The village would not give him up, and they got frustrated, burned down the village. And Lang knew Urdu very well, so newspapers were printed at the same place, his English newspaper and Jami Jamshid, the Urdu newspaper. So he wrote the piece in Urdu and left it over there for the Urdu newspaper to pick it up because he could not print it in his own. And then how do we know about it? Because he himself brags about it in a short story, that there was a rogue British journalist who did these kind of things. He learned Urdu and he could not print this in his own newspaper. So he wrote this entire story and left it at the Urdu press. That is how this, and I wish I never knew such a rogue man, or if I knew him, I would have him punished or something like that. Um, so he makes sure that also this is known.
You know, the process of writing a book, but you can all imagine the hard work that's gone into it. Any questions from anybody? Any comments or clarifications?
No, it's just a comment. Is just one of the best written books I've read in the recent times. I honestly think whether you're in law or journalism or any other field of your life, this book must be read. Absolutely. Just read it for the sense of research that you'll get there.
I think that's what I enjoy about historical novels. The amount of work that goes in and then is shown by the author. The humor, the life which our history books don't really capture.
That's a very interesting statement you've made. And also Mridula Garg in her review has written this is a novel, and she's used devices of Natya Shastra criticism to say that. But this is not a novel. This is purely a history book in which I have written it like a novel. So it's rigorous. There's 60 pages of notes to back up every sentence that is said. But the point is that history can also be written like a novel.
Well, I was actually interested in Alice Richmond, and I would like to know if you would be writing anything on her, because I would read it.
Yeah, that's the next novels. That'll be, it's in more experiment form. John Langer experimented with form. Alice would be a footnoted novel in which, let's say, one chapter would be purely historical, one chapter would be purely fantasy, and it'll run like that and try to weave it together in a seamless narrative. That's the next. There's Dara Shikoh coming up next, and after that is Alice Richmond.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. I reached Lang as a novelist. Lang as a novelist is also very important and very funky, I would say, for the Victorian age. This example I was giving of his description about Ranee, he uses the same paragraph to describe one of his characters. Now, again, with the timeline, I always get confused. The novel is actually from before he met the Rani of Jhansi. So he's probably used the stock description of his female character for the Rani. So we don't know if it's a coincidence or that he found the Rani like that character, or he just used it out of sheer laziness. We do not really know. But the novel is Jenny Dale, or Three Calendars. And calendar is very interesting. I could not understand what this calendar is. So, so he spoofs basically Pride and Prejudice in this novel. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. There are three girls, three guys. They're ball dancers, and like in Jane Austen, one would fall in love with the other. The youngest one is a rogue. There'd be a mild twist, and everybody would get married. Here, something else happens. She falls in love with all the three men, because when they dress in the calendar dress, they look alike. So calendar is Kalandar. And Kalandar is a fakir roaming around in the street who has no affiliation, who is basically in patched up clothes. So for some reason, these people in the British military dress in the calendar dress. And they all look alike when they dress in the calendar dress, and she's fascinated, so she falls in love with all the three. And the other two sisters then something has to be done about it. And one of the standard parts of John Lang's novel is to send the guy to India. One guy to India, because the plot must run in India. Most of the plot must run in India, which is for his propaganda, in which he'd make the character eventually say, England he despised, India he loved. This same character would say, and he says the same, different characters say the same thing in 5 different novels. That line doesn't change. England he despised, India he loved. And so this character is sent to India, so then she settles for the second one, the third one dies, the first one comes back, so he's made to fall in love with the other sister, and so on and so forth. So eventually he solves it like that. And he also solves it in a mocking manner that, look, I'm solving it for you. I don't really intend to solve it. So he'd also kill a couple of characters just like that, probably be bored. But it's a very feminist novel in an age when feminism was not a term. So there's another novel where divorced lady is living with a bachelor, and things like that. So very progressive for that time. He generally collapses the novel to a standard Victorian conclusion, but after having sufficiently mocked at the reader that this is your sensibility, this is the end you want. So either I'll kill these characters or what you want. So in one, there are two sisters. One is white, one is black, and both are products of interracial marriage. And because this half caste woman marries a purebred British man, um, she dies and she turns black in her death, much like her sister. Things like this. So very surreal. It would seem like these are Latin American novels. If the language were changed from Victorian to modern, it almost sound like that. Another novel where he builds it up to this very rich, wealthy white guy coming into the Indian army and being a debauch, and everybody wants him reformed. So and married. So he falls in love with a Bhishti woman who's a Muslim and who's black in color, and he makes all these categories clear. And he says that do not think of black and white in your British terms. They're all shades of brown and white and everything in India. You would not understand. But I'm taking the lowest common denominator, and this guy marries this woman who's also illiterate. And so, of course, there's outrage all over the army, and he gives a long sermon to the priest that is she not a child of God, that you are outraged at this, etc., etc. He makes a big fortune because she has a very good, sharp idea of accounts. He leaves the army and says gets sufficiently tanned enough to pass off as an Indian, wears Indian clothes, becomes a wealthy man. One fine day, he's killed by the thugs in the forest. And then, so he builds it up like that, and then finishes it somewhere like that. And then the rest of the story is about his son, etc. Just to give you a flavor. So that's where I'll stop.